Hi, I'm Pastor Dennis Plant. I'm the principal of Vision Colleges, the very best Bible college on or off the internet. But don't take my word for it. Go for yourself to have a look. visionbiblecollege.edu.au. There you will find the most flexible, affordable set of Bible college studies that you can find anywhere that will equip you for ministry, not just for today, but long into the future. And whether you're a new Christian who is curious, or whether you're not even a Christian but would like to know what the Bible is all about, whether you're a pastor seeking professional development, or whether you're seeking to gain ministerial qualifications, you will find that Vision Bible College has everything you need to meet your study program and study options. So go and have a look, visionbiblecollege.edu.au. But right now, I'm a little bit more interested in presenting another session on our study of the world's greatest story by Ken Chant. Fabulous set of studies, and I can only present little bits of it. I can only present snippets, so to speak. Get the book. Go look for it under the church options, the world's greatest story, and get the book for yourself. Find out what it's about. Find the details that I can't share with you, because it's absolutely and totally fascinating for each and every one of us to be able to find out what was happening in the early church. So here we go with our session, the suffering saints. That's what we're going to be looking at today. Now, the suffering saints is about persecution, and this really is part one, just to have a bit of an overview and to find out why some of that suffering took place. So here we are with our introduction. And what we're going to be looking at, oddly enough, is not just the suffering of the early saints, as it were, but in fact, we're going to be looking at the suffering of some of the saints in the 16th century. You see, during the 16th century, what we saw was what was called the Marian persecutions. These came about when Queen Mary I ascended the throne in England and started to heal the rift between the Catholic and the Protestant church, but it was at a pretty dreadful price. During this time, there were two bishops, Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, and they were burnt at the stake. During the time that the flames began to spring up on them, Latimer cried out, "Plaise a man, Master Ridley, we shall this day light such a candle, by God's grace, in England, as I trust shall never be put out." Do you remember anything about Latimer and Ridley, who they were, why they died, why they were put under such dreadful persecution? You see, the whole hope of these two brave men was that their death would not be in vain, that people would remember the gospel based very much on the price that they had paid. As George Santayana said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And so many people do not remember the cost of the martyrdom to the church, the price the early church paid and has paid down through the centuries to demonstrate the reality of a living God. We should not fail these men, these martyrs. Tertullian made the statement, he said, "The blood of martyrs is the seed of the church, of which the glorious harvest is springing." Well, is it still true today? Have we remembered the price that was paid, that we would have a faith? Because if we do not remember, we run the risk of facing persecutions and perhaps even worse that was faced during the first and second centuries and on into the early church. We need to return to those early Christians to ask, why were they so hated? What drove the imperial authorities to fall into such a frenzy upon the nascent church? We need to explore answers to those questions so that hopefully you and I might be able to escape it. Because one thing that I have observed as I've been going through preparation for these particular studies is some of the awful similarities that I find between the early church and the society in which it was living and the church of today and the societies in which we live. There is, of course, no doubt that the earliest persecutions were those from the Jews. It was the Jews that persecuted the early saints. After all, the early Christians were seen as blasphemers, heretics, as the very worst kind of people, because they were a part of the Jewish faith, or seen as a part of the Jewish faith. That meant that they enjoyed certain respect from the authorities, because as the early church was seen as a sect of Judaism, they enjoyed the benefits of Judaism. That is to say that they were allowed to practice their faith. They didn't have to do some of the things that many other things, such as lighting incense to Caesar and following and respecting the various Roman faiths and beliefs and rituals. But something happened, and that was that the Jewish faith and Christianity finally irreconcilably departed. Up until this time, the Jews were able to call on the Roman authorities and various other authorities for protection from the Jews. But once this separation was recognized, that authority evaporated. It was also amazing that at the same time, although there was an irreconcilable separation between Jew and Christians, there also came about a kind of an uneasy peace that developed between the two, because they still worshipped the same God. Ultimately, it was how they perceived that same God that made a difference. That uneasy peace has remained down through the centuries. Christians have from time to time persecuted Jews because they saw the Jews as the crucifier of Jesus. So that uneasy peace has been there, but it's been fractured from time to time. But largely during the early church, that uneasy peace remained. But whilst that remained, something else began to happen, as we can see, and that is the secular persecutions that began to develop, and these were the persecutions that we read about and were most dreadful. So whilst it's true that the Jewish persecution of the church evaporated and went into the distant background, at the same time, the secular persecutions began to develop. The Roman Empire had recognized the Jews and they'd exempted them from many of the rituals of others. But Christianity, whilst it was seen as a sect of the Jews, it was also exempt. But when the Jews were defeated in 70 AD, that situation changed completely. The destruction of the Jewish nation brought a complete end to Jewish persecutions of the church, but secular antagonism grew until the full power of the state was arrayed against the church in a determined effort to obliterate it. And that was the intent of the early governments and authorities that were available. They were intent on destroying the church. And the reasons for their animosity is not always clear, but there were some probable issues that we can look at. For instance, one of them was the convenient scapegoats that the church was seen as being. Whatever was happening in the world, the church was seen as the reason. And that it was amazing, because it didn't matter what was going on in society. It vented its anger against the church. One of the most early persecutions, of course, was that of Rome in AD 64, associated with Emperor Nero. And our best recollection of that comes from the Annals of Tacitus, who says that Nero, to meet the ugly rumour that a great fire in Rome had been set by his orders, sought to fasten the blame upon the Christians. Some of the Christians, so Tacitus declares, were wrapped in the hides of wild beasts. They were torn to pieces by dogs. Others were fastened to crosses, set on fire to illuminate a circus which Nero staged for the crowds in his own gardens. Tradition, probably reliable reports that both Peter and Paul suffered death in Rome under Nero. Whatever was happening in the community, the Christians were seen as the reason. If there was an earthquake, it was the Christians that were to blame. If there was a flood, the Christians were to blame. If a volcano erupted, the Christians were to blame. If some problem was happening in society that the government could not deal with, the Christians were to blame. Any kind of issue, the Christians were to blame. And the reason was that the Christians were so different from the rest of society. That was the real problem that they had to face. Of course, you might ask why it was happening. It was happening because Christians were different. We are called to be different. We're called to be set apart from the world. And because the Christians would not bow to the Roman Empire, and they would not bow not just to the Roman Empire, but to Greek or any other culture, they would not bow to the very many cultural requirements and religious requirements because of their faith. They were seen as the reason that the gods were turning against the local community. After all, for 10,000 years, for 1,000 years, Rome had reigned supreme, and now suddenly it was crumbling. And as Rome was crumbling, Christianity was rising. And so as Christianity was rising, they were seen as the cause of the distress that was being inflicted upon the nation. So what did they suffer? Well, if you take the time to read Quo Vadis, you're going to see some of this. And here we have an account from that particular book, manuscript, whatever you might want to call it. The Christians have been set on stakes as far as the eye can see. Caesar has determined that he's going to use the Christians to light up one of his celebrations. Rows of resin-soaked stakes have been set up. The Christians have been bound to them, wreathed with flowers of ivy, myrtle leaves. Topping the heights and descending into hollows, the stakes extend such distances that the nearest look like ships' masts, and the furthest like a jumble of flowers-bedecked thirstry. Soon darkness fell, and the first stars began to shine forth. By the side of every condemned person, slaves armed with torches stationed themselves, and as soon as a trumpet sounded, as a signal for the spectacle to commence, each slave applied his torch to the base of the stake beside which he was standing. Upon this straw, saturated with oil, which was concealed beneath the garlands, blazed up into a flame which, ever increasing, soon caused the wreaths of ivy to unroll, until the fire had begun to lick the feet of the victims. The spectators remained silent, but from the garden there was one gigantic groan, compounded of thousands of wails of agony. Nevertheless, many of the victims, with eyes raised to the star-bespangled heavens, started to sing hymns to the glory of Christ. And as some of the people listened, the hearts of even the most hardened among them contracted for a moment, as from the summits of the smaller stakes there came the piteous voices of children crying, "Mother, mother," whilst ruffians in the most advanced state of intoxication could not repress a shudder at the sight of an innocent childish face, contracted with the torture or half veiled by the smoke, which was already suffocating some of the victims. What a dreadful picture Quo Vadis presented to each of us as to the fate of so many Christians. Similarly, around 150 AD, the Christians in Ephesus were blamed for a series of earthquakes which were fiercely harried by the populace. In response to the inquiry, the Emperor Marcus Aurelius wrote a letter to the authorities commanding them to put an end to the persecution unless it could be shown that the Christians actually worked against the state. Concerning these Christians, he wrote, Several governors of the provinces once wrote to my divine father, and he replied that they should not be troubled unless they seemed to be acting treasonably against the Roman government. My reply to those who have written to me as to how to handle Christians has been the same: to follow the policy of my father. We really need to understand something, and that is that Christianity sets us apart from the rest of community. And when it sets you apart because you really believe what you believe, it's going to create issues and difficulty for all of us. There will be persecution, and Jesus made the point. He said, you will be persecuted and hated for my name's sake. And indeed, that was the case at this particular time. Why were the Christians persecuted so readily? Well, here's another reason. They were easy victims because so many times the persecutions were motivated by sheer greed, and it was easy to pick on the Christians themselves. Well, as it happened, it was such a problem that Marcus Aurelius was written by Melito of Sardis in 175, and he wrote this: the race of the godly, a thing that never happened before, is now persecuted, being harassed in Asia by recent decrees for the shameless informers of lovers of men goods, taking it. In other words, what he's saying is that because people loved the possessions of the Christians, and because the Christians stood out against the local community, and because of persecution, it made it easy to blame the Christians for anything and everything. And in order to satisfy our so-called grief, we're going to steal from the Christians. And it was allowed simply because they could do it. They didn't even need a problem. They didn't need an earthquake. They didn't need a flood. They didn't need distress. They didn't need a famine. They just wanted what the Christians had as possessions. And because of the political situation of the day, they were able to simply take what they wanted. It was a dreadful situation that Christians simply had to tolerate. But that was also followed by something else which will be most curious to you, I am sure. And that is this: they were presumed to be atheists. How could that possibly be the case? How could Christians, lovers of Jesus and God, be presumed to be atheists? Well, here's a shock. Not all not all religions are Christian. And Rome was full of religions. It had more religions than you could poke a stick at. Indeed, look, there was no personal relationship between the Roman gods and the Christian God. We have a personal relationship with God. The Romans did not have a personal relationship with their gods, but they had many gods, and those gods were deemed to be the order of society. If you didn't worship the gods, if you didn't do what the gods had, albeit you were doing it as a matter of ritual and form, but the thing is, religion was a powerful part of Roman society. Whether you were going to the arena, whether you were leaving your home, whether you were getting married, whether you were going to go to see some dignitary, if you were visiting friends, if you were going to go shopping, whatever you were doing, religion, the Roman religion, had gods that were associated for it. They had no love for their gods, but they believed that their gods were the source of peace and prosperity. So when they saw people that did not follow the same worship pattern that they followed, they saw them as some kind of atheist. They saw them as a threat to society, because if you were not going to pursue the desires of the local gods, then you would bring the ire of the local gods. And that was a real problem of the day. Of course, you might wonder what that would be. We see, here was the thing. Rome by this time was starting to crumble. The Problems of society were starting to set in. Rome had lasted 1,000 years. It had been extraordinarily successful. But now here what we see is the crumbling of the empire. And we see Christians rising up. And we see that they are seen as blasphemers. They are seen as being atheists. They are seen as being the enemies of the state even. So the Romans simply turned against the Christians because they were hoping, of course, that in that persecution, some of those Christians at least might turn to the Roman gods in order to have an easier life. But of course, it didn't work out at all. At all. The cry of the mob is brought for us in this following incident, and that's recorded for us in like manner. They were condemned to beasts. They that were condemned to beasts underwent awful punishments. They were stretched on sharp shells, punished with various forms of torture that, if it were possible, by means of protracted punishment, the tyrants might induce them to denial. The right noble Germanicus, by means of his endurance, turned their cowardice into courage. With a signal distinction did he fight against the beasts. In his eagerness to be released the sooner from their unrighteous and lawless mode of life, he used force against the wild beast and pulled it upon himself. It was on this that all the multitude, amazed at the noble conduct of the God-loving and God-fearing race of the Christians, shouted out, "Away with the atheists." We'll find that in the New Eusebius, and you'll find it on page 69 and 70 if you choose to go that far. Justin Martyr gained his honorific from the piety and consistency with which he faced scourging and beheading in Rome. He made this statement: "Hence we are called atheists, and we confess that we are atheists so far as the gods of this Roman sort are concerned, but not with respect to the most true God and the Father of righteousness." So you see, the Christians suffered greatly for all manner and cause of reasons, because as a Christian they stood out from society and from the community, because they were a peculiar people. But you see, that is what Jesus has called us to be today. So that brings us to another issue. The Christians were seen as the enemies of mankind. Well, considering Christianity in the 21st century, well, it's hard to understand why that would be so, but the fact is that that is how they were seen in the day. Christians were accused of being enemies against the human race because they were so intransigent in their condemnation of many of the common practices, and because of their refusal to participate in the social, cultural, and religious events. The Roman historian Satiricus, in the Life of Nero, says that punishments were also inflicted upon Christians, a sect that professed a new and troublesome religious belief. Christians seemed to their neighbours to be gloomy separatists. They'd withdrawn from society and wished for nothing so much as the early destruction of civilization. Of course, the problem is, when it comes to that so many preachers would start preaching about the return of Jesus, and they just generally managed to create problems, because they would preach about the soon coming King of Jesus. They would say that he was the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, and so on and so forth. And of course, that is all true, but they did so without great wisdom. Unfortunately, we still see the same things happening today. That their ilk is still amongst us, that people will preach this stuff without wisdom and without understanding, and just fail to realize that sometimes a little wisdom with the preaching will go a long way. Jesus is coming back. Declaring that he is the Lord of Lords is a fact. But to do so and to reject the government of the day is folly. And even Paul told us that we need to honor the government and the king and the emperor, whoever they might be. But that wasn't what was seen in the early church. In fact, the Roman historian Tacitus in 55 to 120 describes Christians as they were commonly viewed at the time. Nero, punished with utmost refinement of cruelty, a class hated for their abominations, which are commonly called Christians. Christus, from their name is derived, was executed at the hands of the procurator Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius. Checked for the moment, this pernicious superstitious again broke out, not only in Judea, the source of evil, but even in Rome. Accordingly, an immense multitude was convicted because of their hatred of the human race. How on earth did they get to that conclusion? Besides being put to death, they were made to serve as objects of amusement, clad in the hides of beasts and torn to death by dogs. Others were crucified, others set to fire to serve to illuminate the night. All this gave rise to a feeling of pity even towards those whose guilt merited the most exemplary punishment, for it was felt that they were being destroyed not for the public good, but to gratify the cruelty of an individual, and that individual, of course, was Nero. But that was the case, that the Christians were being crucified to satisfy the cruelty of Nero, not because of the great good that they were doing, that they were involved with. Christians were thought to be haters of the human race because they were forced by the prevalence of idolatry to withdraw from public life. Almost everything that happened in the city demanded some kind of worship of the gods, and the Christians, of course, refused to do so. We're starting to see evidences of such today, although of course we do not call them gods anymore, but rather the various issues that are raised politically. They take the place of God. It is amazing also that they were considered as being a people of treasonable action. One cannot understand how it is that Christians who spoke highly of emperors and lords and prayed for those that were in oversight should be seen as treasonable people, and yet they were, because they were cutting against the national standards. They were bringing into society a new religion, and that religion was superseding everything in society, and as a result it was seen that they were being treasonous. Imperial cults followed the emperors, and so anyone who was declared to be above the emperor was seen as being treasonous. So Christians were seen as being treasonous. Not only did they import into society Jesus as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, but they saw him above the emperor. That was treason. That was something which could not be tolerated. And so the Christians had to be persecuted once again. And here we see another cause for complaint, and that was the immoral cannibals that the Christians were seen to be. Now, this was something which the Christians brought upon themselves because of the way they conducted their services. Now, of course, some of this was in order to protect the fact that they were persecuted. And so when the Christians met, they met in secret of necessity, but that necessity brought condemnation. But why cannibalism? Well, the custom of admitting only the fully initiated into the Eucharist, which led to garbled reports about Christians eating flesh and drinking blood, practicing cannibalism and incense. So you need to be careful about how you do communion. The covert manner in which, because of persecution, they were met often compelled them to be to wild speculation about what they did in these secret gatherings. the open welcome into the church given to women as well as men, which seemed scandalous in a society which was filled with mystery religions, but those mystery religions only admitted the men. And so this created a huge problem. The warm love Christians were known to offer to each other Christians, even those with whom they had a scanty acquaintance. It led to suspicions of lewd intimacy. The practice of calling each other brother and sister, many interpreted as a sign of homosexuality. So the mutual love, which is still the chief glory of the church, was in the early days a source of scorn to the pagan church world. Tertullian wrote this: "It is mainly the deeds of love, so noble that lead many to put on a brand upon us. See, they say how they love one another, for themselves are animated by mutual hatred, and they are wrath with us too, because we call each other brethren." The Christian church has suffered great persecution over the years, and that just is a gleaming of the things that they've had to deal with over the years. Just a very quick recap of some of those things. Of course, we saw the Jewish persecutions, followed by the secular persecutions, which were followed by the convenient scapegoat approach to Christians, and the fact that they were seen as being easy victims. And in a very religious world, they were presumed to be atheists because they did not believe what the community believed, and they were seen as the enemies of mankind itself, and their actions were considered to be treasonable. And of course, finally, there was the concept of them being immoral cannibals. Society today has changed. It seems to become almost a full circle, not quite yet, but many Christians throughout the world are being persecuted, often for the same kind of reasons. We can allay some of that by being open and transparent. But more important is this: how strong is your faith? Are you strong enough to withstand persecution, or are you, like so many, going to fold and buckle under the issues that you're going to be faced with? Reading through the book of Revelation, it's easy to see that there will be great persecution. Whilst many would tout that there's going to be a great revival before the coming of Jesus, Jesus himself said that there will be a falling away. I fail to see justification for a great revival before the coming of Jesus. I hope it happens. What I do see is that the church is going to come under greater and greater persecution. There have been those who've gone on before us to prove that the persecution can be worthwhile. But it's only worthwhile if you really, truly, honestly believe that Jesus is the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, and he is your Savior. See, that's why we do keep trying to bring these messages to you, because you matter so much. So much, in fact, that God loved the world. That means that God loved you, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And my question to you is, do you have everlasting life? Do you know God so well, so securely, that in the end, if you are faced with persecution, you will be able to bear it? I hope so. So till next time, I'm Pastor Dennis Plant, and you've been studying through the suffering saints from the world's greatest story, which you can get hold of through Vision Colleges, visionbiblecollege.edu.au. Till next time, I'm Pastor Dennis Plant. May the Lord bless you real good.